The house felt eerily quiet, like it had swallowed up all the noise and life that used to fill it. The fridge hummed in the background, its steady buzz only making the silence feel heavier. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second dragging on forever. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that made you overthink everything, turning a simple moment into something loaded with unspoken tension. The kind of quiet where loneliness feels like a brick sitting on your chest. Man, I hate this kind of silence. It's like the walls are judging you. Across the room, Ethan sat at the dining table, slumped in his chair, swirling a glass of dark red wine. His eyes were glazed over, like he wasn't even there anymore. He just stared at the wine, watching it slosh around like it held all the answers. Across from him, Olivia sat straight-backed, her sharp presence cutting through the room. She took a slow sip from her glass, her eyes locked on him, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Mom's business trips are getting longer," she said, her tone casual but with an edge that made it clear she was digging for something. She set her glass down gently, the sound barely breaking the stillness. Ethan let out a long, heavy sigh, like her words had physically hit him. "She's busy. Always has been," he said, his voice flat but with a hint of bitterness he couldn't quite hide. Olivia didn't miss it. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. There was a tension in his shoulders, a sharpness in his gaze that told her there was more he wasn't saying. Ethan wasn't the type to spill his guts, but his silence said enough. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. She tilted her head, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern, like she was waiting for him to admit something he'd been avoiding. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his eyes flicking to hers like he'd been caught off guard. "Tired of what?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. "Of pretending you're okay," she said, her words slow and deliberate. There was no accusation in her tone, just a quiet truth she knew he couldn't ignore. Ethan let out a short, hollow laugh. "You always could see right through me," he said, shaking his head half-heartedly. "Some things don't need to be said." Olivia leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her gaze steady. "And yet, silence doesn't erase what's real," she murmured, her words hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Outside, the wind started to pick up, rattling the windows as the storm grew louder. It felt like the tension in the room was mirroring the chaos outside, both of them holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quieter now, like the words were hard to get out. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said, his gaze distant, like he was seeing something far away. "Always searching for something more, something deeper." Olivia traced the rim of her glass with her finger, her eyes following the motion absently. "Did you ever find it?" she asked, her tone soft but loaded with curiosity. Ethan hesitated, his gaze shifting like he was trying to piece together a memory he'd buried long ago. "I thought I did," he admitted, his voice heavy with something he couldn't quite name. "Then life happened." Olivia sighed, a quiet sound that carried its own weight. She ran a hand through her hair, her fingers lingering at the back of her neck as she thought about his words. "Love is overrated anyway," she muttered, the bitterness in her voice surprising even herself. Ethan studied her, his expression softening. "That's a big statement for someone your age," he said. She gave him a half-smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "When you see love fall apart enough times, you stop believing in the fairy tale." Ethan's gaze softened even more. "Love isn't a fairy tale, Olivia. It's a choice. A hard one." Olivia let out a quiet laugh. "And what happens when someone stops choosing you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Ethan looked away, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. "You learn to live with the absence," he said finally. Olivia exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "That sounds lonely." Ethan met her eyes, something flickering in his expression. "It is." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the tension had shifted into something else, something fragile and electric, like they were both standing on the edge of something they couldn't quite name. Olivia picked up her glass again, taking a slow sip. "Well," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper, "at least tonight you don't have to be alone." Ethan watched her carefully, her words hanging between them like a silent acknowledgement. Outside, the rain began to fall, each drop tapping against the windows like a quiet reminder of the storm. The wine bottle sat between them, half empty, a silent witness to the conversation that had drifted into uncharted territory. Olivia traced the condensation on her glass, her expression unreadable. "You know," she said softly, "I never understood why people stay in love when it stops feeling like love." Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Because sometimes it's not about love anymore. It's about obligation. Familiarity." Olivia scoffed, shaking her head. "That sounds miserable." Ethan gave her a half-smile. "Maybe. But not everyone is brave enough to walk away." Olivia studied him carefully, her eyes searching his face. There was a quiet sadness in his words, something deeper than regret. It was the kind of ache that settles into a person and becomes part of them. "Are you?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, something flickering in his gaze. "Brave enough?" She nodded. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Leaving isn't always the hardest part," he admitted. "Sometimes it's the staying. Waking up every day and choosing to exist in something that no longer fits." Olivia swallowed, gripping her glass tighter. "That's not love, Ethan. That's survival." His lips twitched, like he was about to argue, but he didn't. The silence between them felt charged, something fragile yet electric pressing against the walls of the room. Olivia sighed, shaking her head. "Maybe I'm just naive. Maybe I expect too much," Ethan said, tilting his head slightly. His voice was calm, but there was a weariness in it that Olivia couldn't ignore. "Or maybe you just know what you deserve," she shot back, her eyes locking onto his. For the first time, she didn't see him as her father, not the man she'd grown up idolizing, but as a person. A man who had spent years longing for something more, someone who had given up on the idea that love could still exist for him. "You deserve more too," she added quietly, her voice softer now. Ethan inhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple," he said, his tone heavy with resignation. Olivia smirked, taking another sip of her wine. "It never is." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that felt rare and fragile. Outside, the storm continued its relentless symphony, but inside, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Olivia broke the quiet first. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Regret what?" "Not choosing differently. Not choosing yourself." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Regret is a funny thing. It doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in slowly, filling the spaces you ignored." Olivia watched him for a long moment before nodding. "That's a terrible way to live." His gaze softened, but his words were heavy. "And yet, it's the way most people do." The words lingered, wrapping around them like a whisper of something dangerous, something neither of them wanted to name. The lights flickered for a moment, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. Olivia pulled the oversized jacket tighter around herself, inhaling the faint scent of cologne that clung to the fabric. It was familiar, comforting in a way she didn't want to think too hard about. Ethan watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. The weight of their conversation still hung between them, unshaken by time or distraction. There was something unsettling about how easily they understood each other, how effortlessly they filled the spaces left by years of neglect and quiet loneliness. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice quieter now. Olivia smirked, shaking her head. "And miss the best part of the storm?" "No chance." Ethan chuckled, but it was soft, almost distant. "Still the same stubborn girl. Still the same man who never says what he really wants." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. It was a dangerous kind of silence, the kind that held too many truths neither of them were ready to face. Olivia broke the moment first, turning toward the window. "I used to love nights like this when I was little," she murmured. "You'd sit with me until I fell asleep, tell me that storms sounded worse than they really were." Ethan exhaled, leaning against the back of the couch. And you believed me. She turned to look at him, her gaze steady. I still do. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had closed in, forcing them closer. The distance between them had never felt so thin, the air so thick with things unsaid. Olivia shifted slightly, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the sleeve. Ethan, she said, and his name on her lips sounded different, not wrong, not right, just different. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her spoke volumes. There was something unfamiliar in his expression, hesitation, curiosity, maybe even something deeper. Something neither of them had ever dared to acknowledge before. A single step forward. She wasn't sure if it was her or him, but suddenly, the space between them wasn't enough. The storm raged on outside, the wind rattling against the windows, but inside, the world had gone still. Her pulse quickened as he lifted a hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. It was the lightest touch, barely there, but it sent something electric down her spine. Olivia, he murmured, and it sounded like a warning, or a plea. She didn't move. Couldn't. His fingers lingered just a moment too long before he pulled away, turning his gaze toward the floor. The moment shattered. A phone buzzed loudly on the table, breaking the silence. Emily's name flashed across the screen. Reality crashed down, heavy and unforgiving. Olivia swallowed hard, stepping back. You should answer that. Ethan didn't move. The storm outside wasn't the only one that had just begun. The morning light crept through the curtains, painting the room in soft hues of gold and gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind only damp streets and a silence that felt heavier than before. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, though she wasn't drinking. Her gaze was fixed on nothing in particular, lost in thoughts she couldn't quite organize. Ethan stood by the counter, his hands steady as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The rhythmic sound of the liquid filling the mug was a quiet contrast to the silence between them. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, and though they hadn't exchanged much since last night, neither of them really needed to. The tension in the air had already said more than enough, settling over them like a blanket they were both afraid to disturb. After a long moment, Ethan finally spoke, his voice neutral, betraying no hint of the emotions that must have been brewing beneath. You're leaving today? He asked, as though the question were nothing more than a casual observation, though there was a subtle tightness to it that suggested otherwise. Olivia nodded, her gaze fixed on the counter in front of her, unable or unwilling to meet his eyes. Yeah, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I need to. Ethan exhaled slowly, a soft sigh escaping his lips as if to release the weight of the moment. His fingers tightened around the mug, and he nodded, almost as if to himself. Probably for the best. A bitter, hollow smile flickered across her lips, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. That's all you're going to say? She asked, her voice tinged with quiet disbelief, though she didn't seem surprised. It was more like she was trying to gauge just how little she could expect from him now. He hesitated, looking down at his hands almost as if he were searching for the right words. Instead, his grip on the counter tightened, the movement a subtle indication of just how grounded he was trying to stay in a moment that felt like it was slipping out of his control. What else is there? His voice was steady, but there was something underlying it, a fragility, a weariness, a resignation. Olivia's gaze shifted then, her eyes lifting to meet his, searching his face with an intensity that seemed to cut through the room. Last night, it was a mistake, she said, her words coming out carefully, almost as if she were testing the waters to see if he would fight her on it. But before she could even finish, he cut in, his voice firm though still gentle enough not to cause her further harm. It doesn't matter what I believe, he said, the words carrying more weight than they should have, as if he were giving up the right to have an opinion, to argue, to defend what had happened. Of course it does, she replied, her voice dropping into a quiet, almost resigned tone. It always does. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the history of everything they had shared, of everything that had led them to this point. She was certain now that the truth, the meaning, the clarity of what happened between them mattered, at least to one of them. There was a long pause, a moment where neither of them spoke, but the silence between them spoke louder than anything they could say. The weight of unspoken things, the secrets and regrets, the things they should have said long ago, it all hung there, pressing down on them like the storm that had just passed. The silence between them settled like a wall neither of them dared to break down. Olivia's chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate breath as she set her cup down with a quiet clink, the sound jarring against the stillness. "You know," she began, her voice softer now, like she was trying to make sense of it all, "for a long time, I thought love was supposed to be easy. That when it was right, it wouldn't feel like drowning. It wouldn't feel like you were constantly trying to stay afloat, like you're fighting against the tide just to keep your head above water." She paused, her eyes briefly closing, as if to avoid the vulnerability that lingered in her words. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, though it was hollow, the sound empty of any real amusement. "And now?" he asked, his voice tinged with a sadness he couldn't quite hide. "Now," she said, her voice steady but laced with quiet bitterness, "I think love is just as cruel as it is beautiful. That it's both a gift and a curse, something you cling to even as it pulls you under, because you can't quite let go of it, no matter how much it hurts." Her words trailed off, the weight of the truth hanging in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Ethan's expression faltered then, a crack forming in the mask he'd been holding up. There was a brief flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or grief, that flashed in his eyes. "Olivia," he started, her name falling from his lips like a prayer, a plea, a lifeline he wasn't sure how to reach for anymore. But she shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "It's okay," she said, her voice quiet but firm, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "I get it." With that, she turned away. The distance between them suddenly felt like more than just physical space. It was the distance between two people who had once been so close, who had once thought they could weather anything together, only to find that some storms were impossible to survive without losing pieces of themselves along the way. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward, as if each movement was weighed down by an invisible force. His foot hovered for a moment and then, with a deep breath, he took another tentative step. His gaze fell to the floor for a second, and then, as if seeking some kind of certainty in the silence between them, he hesitated. His shoulders tensed, and he stopped. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, strained. Olivia offered a smile in return, but it was an empty one, worn, like it had lost its genuine spark somewhere along the way. It wasn't the kind of smile that spoke of affection or hope. It was sad. Resigned. Almost tired. "You already did," she replied softly, her words landing between them with the weight of something heavy, something undeniable. Ethan's throat tightened as the words sank into him. They hurt more than he'd expected, sharper than anything he'd braced himself for. His mouth opened and closed, trying to find the right thing to say, but all that came out was a faint whisper. "That was never my intention." His eyes searched hers, but there was no way to undo what had been done. "I know," she whispered back, her voice soft and weary. The understanding between them was both a comfort and a wound that refused to heal. There was nothing left to say, no magic in their words to undo the damage. Olivia shifted slightly, as if preparing to step away, her hands smoothing over the fabric of her jacket in a mechanical, practiced gesture that spoke of too many moments like this one. Another silence fell, one neither of them knew how to break. It hung in the air like an unanswered question, suffocating and thick with unspoken truths. Olivia stood, her movements slow and deliberate, like every action she took was a decision she'd already made. "I should go," she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. Ethan swallowed, the bitter lump in his throat almost choking him. His eyes, desperate and searching, lingered on her. "Will you come back?" The words left his lips before he could think them through, but in his heart, he already knew the answer. He was asking not for her, but for himself, to hold on to something he wasn't ready to let go of. She paused, the briefest of pauses where time seemed to stretch out between them, where everything hinged on her next decision. She considered him, really considered him, as if weighing not just his words but the weight of everything that had come before. Then she gave him a small, bittersweet smile, one that barely touched her eyes. Her voice was almost a whisper when she spoke again. "I think some things are better left unfinished." A lump formed in Ethan's chest, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. There was no argument to be made, no plea he could offer that would change her mind. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them, to say something, anything, that would make this unbearable moment easier. But the truth was, there was nothing left to say. Nothing he could say that hadn't already been said in the silence. With one last lingering glance, Olivia turned toward the door. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like she was leaving not just the room but the remnants of a time that had already passed. Ethan didn't stop her. He didn't say anything. And just like that, she was gone. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, as though her absence wasn't just physical but had carved something out of the very air around him. The house felt emptier than ever, a space too hollow to ignore, too stark to pretend wasn't there. The coffee in Ethan's cup had long since gone cold, the steam now just a memory. He sank down into the chair, his body heavy with a weariness he couldn't shake. He stared at the empty seat across from him, as if willing Olivia to reappear, to fill the silence. But she didn't. Some storms, he thought, never really pass. They don't dissipate or fade away like the weather. Instead, they linger behind a silence, a kind of stillness that's deafening in its intensity. It's the kind of silence that fills the space where words once were, but now nothing seems capable of breaking it. He had convinced himself that time would heal all things, that distance would somehow erase the damage. He thought that given enough time, the sharpness of the pain would dull, that the memories would fade like old photographs, leaving only a blurry outline of what had once been. But time didn't do that. Time only made it worse, twisting the memory into something more complex, something even more painful than he had originally understood. Emily returned from her trip, slipping back into her familiar routine with a casual ease that made everything feel that much more unnatural. She didn't notice the subtle changes in him, how he spoke less now, how his laughter, once so full of life and warmth, barely escaped his lips. She didn't see it because she was too lost in her own world, too preoccupied with the bustle of her life to notice the wreckage that had been left in his. To her, nothing had shifted. But to him, everything had. And in the end, that was what made all the difference. One evening, as the world outside seemed to fade into the comforting quiet of the night, Ethan found himself alone in the dimly lit living room. The low hum of the city outside barely reached his ears as he sat on the edge of the couch, the faint glow of the television screen casting soft shadows across the room. The stillness was almost too much, a reminder of the void that had lingered ever since Olivia left. His thoughts wandered, as they often did when the house was silent, back to moments he had hoped would never fade. Then, as if the universe had decided to break the quiet, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen, the vibration pulling him from his thoughts. A message. The familiar name flashed at the top, Olivia. His heart gave an involuntary lurch. Even now. Olivia. I hope you're doing okay, her message read. The words were simple, almost too simple for the weight of what they once shared. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling just slightly as memories swirled in his mind. What could he say? What should he say? His thoughts were tangled, pulling him in two directions. One where he could admit the truth, lay bare the feelings he had never fully expressed. Tell her that he still thought about her when the world grew quiet, that her absence echoed in every corner of his life. That he still replayed every word they had exchanged, every laugh they had shared, every lingering look that spoke volumes without saying anything at all. But that wasn't how he did things, was it? Not anymore. Instead of being honest, vulnerable, and raw, he took a steadying breath, his mind racing to construct something safe, something that wouldn't expose the depth of his feelings. He typed back something expected, something that wouldn't make her linger on what was clearly over. I'm fine. Take care of yourself. The message felt hollow as soon as he hit send. He stared at the screen, watching the text fade into the background. And for a long moment, the silence in the room grew unbearable. He waited, telling himself that the wait didn't matter, that it didn't matter if she replied or even if she saw the message. But deep down, he couldn't shake the hope that she would, just one last time. Minutes stretched, and the phone remained still. No new notifications. No response. Slowly, Ethan exhaled, a deep, weary sigh, as if he had just let go of something he hadn't realized he was still holding on to. He set the phone down beside him on the couch, the absence of the screen's glow suddenly feeling more profound than any message could have received. Maybe this was how it was meant to end, not with dramatic confrontations or tearful confessions, but with a quiet, resigned acceptance. A slow, subtle fading of what once was. No grand gestures, no final moments of catharsis. Just a soft, inevitable drifting apart, like two people floating in opposite directions, unable to hold on anymore, even if they still wanted to. Some connections, he knew, no matter how deep they had once been, were never meant to last forever. They were fleeting moments in the grand tapestry of life, marked not by endings but by the lessons they left behind. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that thought settle in. Outside, the sky was clear, the remnants of a storm that had once shaken the world long gone, leaving only the stars as silent witnesses. But inside, in the quiet of his heart, Ethan knew that something far stormier had just begun. And this time, there would be no turning back.